Dusty trails, a dying beauty, and a rich cowboy's choice that would ignite a firestorm. What if saving a life meant surrendering your own? In the heart of the unforgiving West, a single act of mercy binds two worlds together, not by love, but by a sacred, unbreakable law. When a lone cattle baron, a man who answers to no one, finds a Native American woman at death's door, his decision to save her triggers a consequence he never imagined. Her tribe, honoring a timeless tradition, declares she must become his wife. This isn't a romance, it's a reckoning. The sun beat down on the sprawling canvas of the Montana Territory, a relentless hammer forging the land in shades of ochre and burnt sienna. From his vantage point, atop a chestnut stallion, Clayton Clay Forrester surveyed his domain. The Forrester Ranch, the Triple F, was a testament to his grit and his father's legacy, a sprawling empire of cattle and grass that stretched as far as the eye could see. At 35, Clay was a man carved from the very same rugged landscape he commanded. His face, weathered by the sun and wind, was a roadmap of long days and hard-won victories. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, missed nothing. He was a man of few words and even fewer attachments. His heart walled off since the cholera outbreak that had claimed his family a decade prior. He was tracking a small group of stray longhorns that had broken away from the main herd, their tracks leading him further into the Badlands, a treacherous labyrinth of canyons and hoodoos that even the most seasoned cowboys avoided. It was here, in this desolate wilderness, that fate, in its cruel and mysterious way, intervened. A flash of color against the red rock caught his eye. It was a flicker of deep turquoise and crimson colors, too vibrant for the muted landscape. Dismounting, Clay tethered his horse, Apollo, to a gnarled juniper and cautiously approached. The air was still heavy, with an unspoken tension. As he drew closer, the scene resolved into a harrowing tableau. A young woman lay sprawled on the parched earth, her deerskin dress torn and stained with blood. Her face, framed by a cascade of raven-black hair, was pale, her lips tinged with blue. A wicked-looking gash ran down her leg, the flesh around it swollen and angry. An empty water skin lay beside her, a poignant symbol of her desperate struggle. She was Native American, her features delicate yet fierce, a daughter of the plains. Clay recognized the intricate beadwork on her dress as belonging to the Apsa-Aluke, or Crow, a tribe that occasionally traded with the nearby town of Miles City. He knelt beside her, his medical training from his brief stint in the army kicking in. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse a faint, thready flutter beneath his fingers. He didn't know her name, her story, or what had brought her to this forsaken place, but he knew one thing, with chilling certainty: if he left her, she would die. For a moment, he hesitated. Getting involved was a risk. Tensions between the settlers and the native tribes were a constant simmering pot on the verge of boiling over. Bringing a Crow woman, an injured one at that, back to his ranch would set tongues wagging, and not in a good way. It would be an invitation for trouble, a disruption to the carefully constructed solitude of his life. But then her eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes as dark and deep as a midnight sky. They held a flicker of defiance, a spark of life that refused to be extinguished. In that fleeting moment, she wasn't a Crow woman, a potential problem, or a symbol of the ongoing conflict. She was just a human being fighting for her life. And Clay Forrester, for all his guardedness and cynicism, could not turn his back on that. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire territory, he gently scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile bird with a broken wing. As he carried her towards Apollo, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was carrying more than just a dying woman. He was carrying a future he hadn't chosen, a destiny he couldn't possibly have foreseen. The Badlands watched him go, their ancient secrets held close, the silence broken only by the steady clop of Apollo's hooves and the ragged whisper of the woman's breath against his chest. He was Clayton Forrester, A man who thought he had everything he could ever want. A man who was about to discover how much he had to lose. The journey back to the Triple F was a race against time, a desperate gamble against the setting sun and the encroaching shadow of death. He pushed Apollo harder than he ever had before, the rhythmic gallop, a prayer whispered into the vast, indifferent expanse of the West. He was a rich cowboy who had just saved a dying native beauty. He had no idea that in doing so, he had just sealed his own fate, binding his life to hers in a way he could never have imagined. Her name, he would later learn, was Chaitan, a name that in her language meant falcon. And like a falcon, she had a spirit that could not be caged. The journey back to the Triple F was a blur of dust and desperation. Clay rode with a singular focus, the woman's life, a fragile flame he cupped in his hands against the wind. He bypassed the main house, heading straight for the small infirmary he'd built for his ranch hands, a clean, well-stocked cabin that had seen its share of broken bones and fevers. He burst through the door, shouting for Maria, the wife of his foreman, and the unofficial den mother of the ranch. She was a woman of ample girth and an even more ample heart, her weathered face a testament to a life of hard work and quiet resilience. She took one look at the woman in Clay's arms and her eyes widened, but she didn't waste time with questions. "Get her on the cot," she ordered, her voice calm and steady, "and get some water boiling." For the next few hours, the infirmary was a flurry of activity. Clay and Maria worked in tandem, a silent, efficient team. He cleaned and stitched the gash on her leg, his hands surprisingly gentle for a man more accustomed to branding irons and bridle reins. Maria brewed a potent concoction of herbs, a recipe passed down from her grandmother in Mexico to fight the fever that was already beginning to consume the woman. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ranch, the woman's fever broke. The color began to return to her cheeks, and her breathing deepened into a steady, even rhythm. Clay, exhausted but relieved, sank into a chair, his gaze fixed on the sleeping woman. He had saved her, but now came the hard part. What was he going to do with her? His foreman and best friend, Jedediah Jed Stone, a man as solid and dependable as his name suggested, found him there staring into the middle distance. Jed was a man of few words, but his eyes, a clear, honest blue, spoke volumes. And right now, they were full of concern. "Clay," he said, his voice a low rumble. "What in the Sam Hill is going on? The boys are spooked. They're saying you brought a crow woman back to the ranch." Clay ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. "Her name is Chaitan." He said the name, feeling strange on his tongue. "And I found her in the Badlands. She was dying, Jed. I couldn't just leave her." "I know you couldn't," Jed said, his voice softening. "You're a good man, Clay. But you know as well as I do that this is going to cause a heap of trouble. The folks in Miles City ain't exactly known for their progressive views on relations with the natives." "I don't give a damn what the folks in Miles City think," Clay retorted, his voice sharp. "This is my ranch, and I'll do as I please. It ain't just the townies, Clay." Jed pressed his gaze unwavering. "What about her people? You think they're just going to let one of their own disappear without a trace? They'll come looking for her, and when they find her here on your land, well, it ain't going to be a friendly chat over a cup of coffee." Clay knew Jed was right. He had considered the same thing on the ride back. But seeing Chaitan lying there so vulnerable and yet so resilient had stirred something in him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. It was a feeling of protectiveness, of responsibility. He couldn't just cast her out, not now. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it," Clay said, his voice firm. "For now, she stays here until she's strong enough to leave." Jed sighed, knowing that once Clay had made up his mind, there was no changing it. "All right, boss," he said, clapping a hand on Clay's shoulder. "But you'd better be prepared for a storm, because I've got a feeling the wind is about to start howling." The next few days passed in a tense quiet. Chaitan, as they had come to call her, slowly regained her strength. She was a quiet patient, her dark eyes following their every move with a mixture of suspicion and gratitude. She spoke little English, and their attempts at communication were mostly limited to gestures and single words. But a fragile truce began to form between them, an unspoken understanding that transcended language and culture. The news of the Indian woman at the Triple F spread like wildfire through the surrounding area. The ranch hands, a rough and tumble bunch, were divided. Some, like the younger, more open-minded ones, were curious and even a little sympathetic. Others, the older, more set-in-their-ways cowboys, muttered darkly about savages and bad omens. The tension came to a head one evening in the bunkhouse. A grizzled old hand named Silas, his face a permanent scowl, started spouting off about the crow squaw in the infirmary. "It ain't right," he slurred his words, thick with whiskey. "Bringing one of them here. They're nothing but trouble. Mark my words, she'll bring the whole damn tribe down on us." Before anyone could react, a young cowboy named Billy, who had been secretly leaving wildflowers by the infirmary door, was on his feet. "Shut your damn mouth, Silas," he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and bravado. "She's just a woman, and she was hurt. The boss did the right thing." Silas sneered, his eyes glinting with malice. "The boss has gone soft in the head," he spat, "and you're just a starry-eyed pup who's sweet on a pretty face." He lunged at Billy, his fists raised. The bunkhouse erupted into a brawl, the men's pent-up fears and prejudices finally exploding into violence. It was Clay, alerted by the commotion, who broke it up, his voice cracking like a whip. "Enough!" He roared, his presence alone enough to quell the chaos. He fired Silas on the spot, his message clear: anyone who disrespected Chayton would have to answer to him. The incident solidified the divisions on the ranch, but it also solidified Clay's resolve. Chayton was under his protection, and he would be damned if he let anyone harm her. But as he stood in the doorway of the infirmary that night, watching her sleep, a new fear began to creep into his heart. It wasn't the fear of the townspeople or a potential conflict with the crow. It was a fear of the unfamiliar emotions she was stirring within him, a fear of the walls he had so carefully built around his heart beginning to crumble. He was a man who had always been in control, but for the first time in his life, Clayton Forrester was flying blind. And the storm Jed had predicted was no longer a distant threat on the horizon. It was here, and it was just beginning. The dust cloud appeared on the horizon, first a faint smudge against the brilliant blue of the Montana sky. But it grew steadily a harbinger of the approaching storm Jed had predicted. The lookout in the newly constructed watchtower, a precaution Clay had reluctantly agreed to, sounded the alarm. The ranch hands, their earlier squabbles forgotten in the face of a common and potentially hostile unknown, scrambled for their rifles, their faces a mixture of fear and grim determination. Clay stood on the porch of the main house, his hand resting on the Colt Peacemaker at his hip. Beside him, Jed held a Winchester, his knuckles white. Chayton, now strong enough to walk with a slight limp, stood in the doorway, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with a fierce light. She recognized the approaching riders. They were her people. A large party of Crow warriors, at least 50 strong, rode into the main yard of the Triple F. They were a magnificent and intimidating sight, their faces painted for war, their eagle feather war bonnets, a stark contrast to the drab colors of the ranch. They were led by a tall, imposing man with a stern, unyielding face. His name was Kills Straight, the war chief of their clan and Chayton's older brother. He dismounted his warriors, fanning out behind him, their movements fluid and practiced. He strode towards the porch, his eyes as dark and piercing as a hawk's, fixed on Clay. "You are the man who took my sister," he said, his English heavily accented, but clear. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. "I am the man who saved your sister," Clay corrected him, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "She was dying in the Badlands, I brought her here and tended to her wounds. Killstraight's gaze flickered to Chaitan, a flicker of relief in his otherwise impassive expression. He then turned his attention back to Clay, his eyes narrowing. You have done a brave thing, he acknowledged, his voice begrudging. But you have also created a problem. I don't see a problem, Clay said, his hand still on his gun. Your sister is well. She is free to leave with you. Killstraight shook his head, a slow, deliberate movement. It is not that simple, he said. You have saved her life. According to the laws of our people, a life saved is a life owed. Her life now belongs to you. Clay stared at him, uncomprehending. What are you talking about? He asked, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. He is saying, a new voice interjected, that by saving her, you have in effect chosen her as your wife. An old man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, and his hair as white as the winter snow, stepped forward. He was the clan's medicine man, a man of great wisdom and authority. His name was Runs with the Wind. It is our way, he explained, his voice raspy with age. A woman who is saved by a man outside of her own tribe is considered to be a bridge between two peoples. To ensure her safety and honor, she must become his wife. It is a sacred bond, an unbreakable law. The silence that followed was so profound that Clay could hear the buzzing of a fly on the porch railing. He looked from the medicine man to Killstraight, and then to Chaitan. Her face was unreadable, her dark eyes veiled. You can't be serious, Clay said, his voice a hoarse whisper. I'm not. We can't. It is the law. Killstraight repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument. You will marry my sister, or you will answer to the warriors of the Apsaaluke. The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Clay looked at the 50 warriors surrounding his ranch, their faces grim, their hands on their weapons. He looked at Jed, whose face was a mask of disbelief. He looked at his own ranch hands, outnumbered and outmatched. And then he looked at Chaitan. She had taken a step forward, her chin held high. She spoke to her brother in their native tongue, her voice a torrent of passionate words. He listened, his face impassive, and then he responded, his tone unyielding. The old medicine man added a few quiet words, and then all eyes were on Clay once more. Chaitan turned to him, her voice barely a whisper. It is the only way, she said, her English slow and careful. To refuse is to declare war. Many will die, on both sides. Clay felt like he was caught in a nightmare, a surreal and inescapable trap. He was a man who valued his freedom above all else, a man who had sworn off all attachments. And now he was being forced into the most binding of all contracts, a marriage to a woman he barely knew, a woman from a world he didn't understand. But as he looked at Chaitan, he saw not just a stranger, but the woman whose life he had saved, the woman who had shown him a strength and resilience he had never known. He saw the potential for a bloodbath for his ranch to become a battlefield for his men to die, and he knew with a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach that he had no choice. All right, he said the word, tasting like ash in his mouth. I'll do it. I'll marry her. A murmur went through the Crow warriors. Killstraight gave a curt nod, a flicker of something that might have been respect in his eyes. The old medicine man smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made Clay's skin crawl. But as he looked at Chaitan, he saw no triumph in her eyes. He saw only a reflection of his own, trapped and uncertain future. They were two people from different worlds bound together by a single act of mercy and an ancient, unbreakable law. Their marriage would not be a celebration of love, but a fragile truce, a desperate attempt to bridge an impossible divide. And as the sun began to set on the most surreal day of his life, Clay Forrester couldn't help but wonder if in saving Chaitan's life he had just condemned them both. The rich cowboy had his bride, but he had lost his freedom. And the real drama, he suspected, was only just beginning. The wedding, if one could call it that, was a strange and somber affair. It took place the very next day, a concession Clay had managed to wrangle from Kill Strait, who had been adamant that the union be immediate. There was no preacher, no white dress, no joyful celebration. Instead, it was a ceremony steeped in Crow tradition, a ritual that was both fascinating and deeply unsettling to the white onlookers. The ceremony was presided over by Runs with the Wind, the old medicine man. He led Clay and Chayton to the center of the ranch yard where a small fire had been built. He chanted in the Apsaluka tongue, his voice a low hypnotic drone, the smoke from the fire carrying his words up to the heavens. He took a ceremonial pipe, filled it with tobacco, and offered it to the 4 cardinal directions, to Mother Earth and to the Great Spirit. He then handed the pipe to Clay. "You will smoke," he instructed. "You will offer your breath to her, and she will offer hers to you. Your spirits will mingle, and you will be as one." Clay, feeling the weight of every eye upon him, took the pipe. The smoke was harsh and unfamiliar in his lungs. He passed it to Chayton, their fingers brushing for a fleeting moment. She took the pipe and smoked her movements, graceful and practiced. Next, Runs with the Wind took a strip of tanned buckskin and tied their wrists together, his gnarled fingers surprisingly gentle. "What the Great Spirit has joined together," he said, his dark eyes boring into Clay's, "let no man put asunder." And that was it. They were married. There was no kiss, no "I do's," no joyous pronouncements, just a shared pipe, a strip of leather, and the heavy, unblinking gaze of 50 Crow warriors. The rest of the day was a blur of forced hospitality. Clay, ever the pragmatist, had ordered his men to slaughter a steer, and a feast of sorts was held. The Crow warriors, their initial hostility, replaced by a wary curiosity, mingled with the ranch hands, the 2 groups a study in contrasts. There were a few tentative attempts at communication, a shared drink of whiskey, a grudging admiration of a well-crafted rifle. But the underlying tension remained a palpable thing that hung in the air like the dust from the plains. Clay found himself watching Chayton, his wife. She moved through the crowd with a quiet dignity, a woman caught between 2 worlds. He saw the way she spoke to her brother, her voice a mixture of respect and defiance. He saw the way she comforted a young Crow boy who was frightened by the strange surroundings, and he saw the way she looked at him, her eyes a swirling vortex of emotions he couldn't begin to decipher. That night, after the last of the Crow had retired to their temporary camp at the edge of his property, Clay stood on the porch, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The silence of the ranch was a welcome reprieve after the surreal events of the day. He was a married man. The thought was so absurd, so utterly preposterous, that he almost laughed. The screen door creaked open, and Chayton stepped out onto the porch. She was wearing a simple deerskin dress, her hair unbound and cascading down her back. In the soft moonlight, she was breathtakingly beautiful, and she was his wife. "You are not happy," she said, her voice a soft murmur. It was not a question. "Can you blame me?" he replied, his voice rougher than he intended. "I was a free man yesterday. Today I'm shackled." He immediately regretted the words when he saw the flicker of hurt in her eyes. "That's not... I didn't mean..." he stammered, feeling like a clumsy fool. "I understand," she said, her voice quiet. "You did not ask for this. Neither did I." They stood in silence for a long moment, the only sound the chirping of the crickets. "Why did you agree to this?" he finally asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. "You could have refused. You could have gone back with your brother." She turned to face him, her dark eyes searching his. "If I had refused," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "my brother would have seen it as an insult. He would have sought to restore his honor and the honor of our clan. There would have been a battle. Your men would have died. My people would have died. And for what? For my freedom, my life is not worth more than theirs." Her words were a punch to the gut. He had been so wrapped up in his own loss of freedom that he hadn't considered the sacrifice she had made. She had married him a stranger, an enemy, in the eyes of some of her people to prevent a war. "I am sorry," he said the words, feeling inadequate. "I didn't think." "You think like a white man," she said, a faint smile touching her lips. "You think of yourself. My people, we think of the tribe. The good of the many outweighs the desires of the one." "It's a heavy burden to carry," he said, his voice soft. "It is our way," she replied simply. Another silence fell between them, but this one was different. It was less tense, more contemplative. Clay found himself looking at her, not as a burden, a problem, or a symbol of his lost freedom, but as a woman of incredible strength and selflessness. "My quarters are in the main house," he said, finally breaking the silence. "The master bedroom. It's large. There's a dressing room. You can have that. I'll take one of the guest rooms." She nodded, a silent acceptance of his offer. It was a small gesture, a recognition of the strangeness of their situation, but it was a start. As she turned to go inside, a new thought struck Clay, a chilling premonition that sent a shiver down his spine. "Chaitan," he said, his voice urgent. "Your brother? Kill straight. He agreed to this marriage, but he doesn't seem like the kind of man who forgives easily. Does he blame me for what happened to you? For you getting lost in the Badlands?" Chaitan froze her back to him. When she finally turned, her face was a mask of worry. "There was a disagreement," she admitted, her voice low. "I was supposed to marry another man, a warrior from a neighboring clan. It was an arranged marriage to create an alliance. I ran away." The revelation hit Clay like a physical blow. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. Chaitan hadn't just been lost in the Badlands. She had been a fugitive. And her brother killed straight. He hadn't just been looking for his sister. He had been looking for a way to salvage a broken political alliance. So this other warrior, Clay began his mind racing. "He's still out there. He thinks you're his intended bride." Chaitan nodded, her eyes full of a fear that she could no longer hide. "His name is Two Moons," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And he is not a man who takes kindly to being dishonored. He will not be happy to learn that I am now the wife of a white man." The fragile truce Clay had brokered with the crow suddenly felt a lot more fragile. He had thought his biggest problem was a forced marriage and the disapproval of his neighbors. But now he had a new and potentially far more dangerous enemy. Two Moons, a jilted warrior with a score to settle. The storm, it seemed, was far from over. In fact, a whole new and more violent one was brewing on the horizon. Clay Forrester, the rich cowboy, who had just wanted to be left alone, was now caught in the middle of a tribal feud with his new unwilling wife at the very center of the storm. And he had a sinking feeling that this was a conflict that couldn't be solved with money or guns. This was a conflict of honor, tradition, and blood, and it was coming for him. The days that followed the wedding were a study in awkward domesticity. Clay and Chaitan, two strangers bound by a sacred law they didn't understand, circled each other like wary wolves. They shared a house but not a home. They shared meals in a stilted silence, the clinking of silverware the only conversation. And they shared a bed, a massive four-poster that felt more like a battlefield than a place of rest. Clay, true to his word, had taken to sleeping in the adjoining dressing room, a gesture of respect that Chaitan silently appreciated. Life on the Triple F settled into a new, uneasy rhythm. The Crow warriors, with the exception of Kill Straight and a small contingent who remained as a guard of honor for Chaitan, had departed, their presence replaced by a lingering sense of unease. The ranch hands, taking their cue from Clay, treated Chaitan with a grudging respect, but she remained an outsider, a beautiful, exotic bird in a cage of her own making. Chaitan, however, was not one to sit idle. She had a spirit that refused to be confined, a resilience forged in the crucible of her people's harsh existence. She began to find her place on the ranch, not as the boss's wife, but as a contributor in her own right. She had a deep and intuitive understanding of the land, a knowledge that surpassed that of even the most seasoned cowboys. She could predict the weather by the behavior of the birds, find hidden sources of water, and identify medicinal plants that even Maria, with her herbal remedies, had never seen before. Clay found himself watching her, a reluctant admiration growing in his heart. He saw the way she gentled a spooked horse with a soft word and a steady hand. He saw the way she mended a torn shirt with stitches so fine they were almost invisible. And he saw the way she taught young Billy, the cowboy who had defended her, how to track a deer, her movements fluid and graceful, a part of the very landscape she was reading. One evening, he found her in the stables tending to Apollo, his stallion. She was speaking to the horse in her native tongue, her voice a soft melodic murmur. The horse, usually a spirited and sometimes cantankerous animal, was calm and docile under her touch. "He likes you," Clay said, his voice startling her. She turned her hand still on Apollo's neck. "He is a good horse," she said simply. "He has a strong spirit." Like his owner, Clay said the words, slipping out before he could stop them. A faint blush colored her cheeks, a rare and surprising sight. "You have a strong spirit too." "Clayton Forrester," she said, using his full name for the first time. "You are stubborn, like a mule." He laughed, a genuine, unforced laugh that surprised them both. "I've been called worse," he admitted. It was a small moment, a crack in the wall of formality that separated them, but it was a start. They began to talk their conversations, hesitant at first, but gradually growing more comfortable. He told her about his family, about the cholera that had taken them, about the loneliness that had been his constant companion ever since. She told him about her people, about their traditions, their beliefs, their deep connection to the land. He learned that her name, Chaitan, meant falcon, because she had been born on a day when a falcon had circled their camp, a sign of a strong and independent spirit. He learned that the beadwork on her dress told the story of her family, each color and pattern a symbol of their history. And he learned about 2 moons. "He is a great warrior," she told him one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight. "But his heart is full of pride. He saw our marriage as a way to increase his power, his influence. He did not see me." "And you?" Clay asked, his voice soft. "Did you see him?" She shook her head. "I saw a cage," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "A different kind of cage than this one, but a cage nonetheless." Her words resonated with him, with his own feelings of being trapped. They were both prisoners of circumstance, bound by forces beyond their control. But in their shared captivity, they were beginning to find a strange sort of freedom, the freedom to be themselves, to shed the masks they had worn for so long. The fragile peace of their burgeoning relationship was shattered by the arrival of a rider from Miles City. He brought news, and it was not good. A group of Crow warriors led by a charismatic and aggressive brave named 2 Moons had been raiding settlements along the Yellowstone River. They were not a large war party, but they were bold and reckless, and they were leaving a trail of fear and resentment in their wake. "They're saying he's looking for something," the rider said, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. "Or someone. They say his intended bride was stolen from him by a white man." Clay's blood ran cold. The threat that had been a distant rumble on the horizon was now a full-blown storm, and it was heading straight for the Triple F. He looked at Chaitan, her face bold, her eyes full of the fear she had been trying so hard to hide. That night, he found her in the stables again, her arms wrapped around Apollo's neck, her body trembling. He didn't say a word. He just stood beside her, his presence a silent offer of support. After a long moment, she turned to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. And "He will come here," she whispered. "He will not rest until he has found me." "Let him come," Clay said, his voice a low growl. "This is my land. You are my wife. I will protect you. The word wife still felt strange on his tongue, but for the first time it didn't taste like ash. It tasted like a promise he intended to keep. She looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his. And then she did something that surprised them both. She leaned forward and kissed him. It was a soft, hesitant kiss, a fragile and tentative thing, but it was a kiss that sealed their unlikely alliance, a kiss that transformed their forced marriage into something more. It was a kiss that said, "We are in this together." As he kissed her back, the walls he had so carefully built around his heart finally came crashing down. He was no longer just her protector, he was her husband, and he would be damned if he let anyone, white man or Indian, lay a hand on her. 2 Moons was coming. Let him come. Clayton Forrester was ready for a fight. The rich cowboy had found something more valuable than all his land and all his cattle. He had found something worth fighting for, and he would fight for her until his last breath. The storm had arrived, and the battle for Chayton's future and for the future of the Triple F was about to begin. The attack came at dawn, the time of ghosts and shadows, when the world is caught between darkness and light. 2 Moons was a cunning strategist. He didn't announce his arrival with a dust cloud on the horizon. He came silently under the cover of the pre-dawn mist, his warriors moving like spectres through the tall grass. The first warning was a single piercing cry from the lookout, cut short with a sickening finality. Then, the night erupted into a cacophony of war cries and gunfire. The Triple F, which had been a place of burgeoning peace, was transformed into a battlefield. Clay was already awake. He had been for hours a gnawing sense of dread keeping him from sleep. He had been on the porch, a rifle in his hand, when the first shot was fired. He didn't hesitate. "To the main house," he roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Barricade the doors and windows." The ranch hands, caught by surprise but not unprepared, scrambled to obey. They had been drilling for this possibility for weeks, ever since the news of 2 Moons raiding had reached them. Jed was already at the bunkhouse, organizing the men, his calm presence a steadying influence in the storm of panic. Clay raced back into the house, his heart pounding in his chest. He found Chayton in the main room, her face a mask of grim determination. She was not cowering in fear. She was holding a Winchester rifle, her knuckles white, but her hands steady. "I will fight," she said, her voice clear and strong. He looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, and his heart swelled with a fierce pride. "I know you will," he said, his voice full of a love that he no longer tried to hide. The battle for the Triple F was a brutal and bloody affair. 2 Moons warriors were fierce and skilled, but Clay's men were fighting for their homes, for their lives, and they had the advantage of fortified positions. The main house, a sturdy log and stone structure, became a fortress. The fighting raged for hours, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Clay fought with a cold, deadly fury, his every shot finding its mark. He was not just fighting for his ranch. He was fighting for his wife, for the future they were just beginning to build together. Chayton fought beside him, her movements fluid and efficient. She was a warrior in her own right, her aim true, her spirit unbreakable. They were a team, a husband and wife forged in the crucible of battle. But 2 Moons was relentless. He pressed the attack, his warriors swarming the outbuildings, setting fire to the barn and the stables. The sight of the flames of his legacy going up in smoke sent a pang of despair through Clay's heart. But he gritted his teeth and kept fighting. The ranch could be rebuilt. His life with Chayton could not. The tide of the battle began to turn when 2 Moons himself, a towering figure of rage and fury, broke through the main gate and charged towards the house. He was a terrifying sight, his face painted in streaks of black and red, his eyes burning with a fanatical light. "Chayton!" he roared, his voice a guttural cry of rage and possession. "You are mine. I have come for what is mine." He was met with a volley of gunfire from the house, but he seemed to bear a charmed life, the bullets whizzing past him as he charged forward. He reached the porch, his tomahawk raised ready to smash through the door. And then a new sound cut through the din of battle, a war cry, familiar and yet unexpected, a cry of the Apsa Aluke. From over the rise, a new group of warriors appeared, riding hard and fast. They were led by Kill Straight, his face a thundercloud of fury. He had returned. He and his warriors slammed into Two Moon's flank, a whirlwind of righteous fury. The battle, which had been a siege, was now a chaotic melee in the ranch yard. Kill Straight, his eyes blazing, sought out Two Moons. The two warriors, the jilted groom and the protective brother, met in a clash of steel and fury. Their battle was a primal dance of violence, a personal conflict at the heart of the larger war. Clay watched from the window, his rifle raised, but he didn't fire. This was not his fight to finish. This was a matter of honor between two Crow warriors. The duel was short and brutal. Kill Straight, though smaller than Two Moons, was faster and more skilled. He ducked under a wild swing of Two Moons' tomahawk and drove his own knife deep into his opponent's side. Two Moons staggered back, his eyes wide with surprise and pain. He looked at Chaitan, who was watching from the doorway, a look of mingled hatred and longing on his face. And then he fell. With the death of their leader, the fight went out of Two Moons' warriors. Some surrendered, others fled into the wilderness. The battle for the Triple F was over. The aftermath was a scene of devastation. The ranch was a smouldering ruin, the ground littered with the bodies of the dead and wounded. But they had survived, Clay, his face grimy with soot, and his arm bleeding from a shallow gash, found Chaitan in the midst of the chaos. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, his heart overflowing with a relief so profound it was almost painful. "It's over," he whispered into her hair. "It's finally over." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears. "You saved me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Again." "We saved each other," he corrected her, his voice hoarse. Kill Straight approached them, his face grim, but his eyes full of a newfound respect for Clay. He looked from his sister to the white man, who was her husband, and he saw not a forced alliance but a genuine bond. "You have fought with honor, Clayton Forrester," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You have protected my sister. You have earned my respect." He then turned to Chaitan, and for the first time Clay saw a flicker of warmth in the stoic warrior's eyes. "You have chosen well, little sister," he said, his voice softer than Clay had ever heard it. "He is a good man." It was the highest praise Kill Straight could offer a blessing on their unlikely union. As the sun began to set on the blood-soaked ground of the Triple F, Clay stood with Chaitan on the porch of their battered but still standing house. The ranch was in ruins, but they were alive and they were together. And as he looked at his wife, at the falcon, who had flown into his life and changed it forever, he knew that he was the richest man in Montana. He had lost a fortune in cattle and buildings, but he had gained something far more valuable. He had gained a love that was as wild and untamed as the land itself, a love that had been forged in fire and sealed in blood. The war was over, but their story was just beginning. And for the first time, Clayton Forrester looked to the future, not with dread, but with a heart full of hope. The rich cowboy had saved the dying native beauty, and in doing so, he had saved himself. And in the heart of the unforgiving West, a new and unlikely dynasty was about to be born. In the months and years that followed the Battle of the Triple F, as it came to be known in the hushed tones of local legend, a new kind of life took root on the Forrester Ranch. The smouldering ruins were cleared away, not with a sense of loss, but with a spirit of renewal. The rebuilding was a communal effort, a testament to the bonds that had been forged in the crucible of conflict. The ranch hands, who had once viewed Chaitan with suspicion, now treated her with a deep and abiding respect. She was no longer the Indian woman, but Mrs. Forrester, a title she wore with a quiet dignity. But more than that, she was Chayton, the woman who had fought beside them, the woman whose wisdom of the land had saved them more than once from the harsh realities of the Montana wilderness. Kill Strait and his people became regular visitors to the Triple Fitsue. The initial wary truce blossomed into a genuine friendship, an alliance built not on a forced marriage, but on mutual respect and shared experience. The Crow brought their knowledge of the land of hunting, of survival. The Triple F offered its resources, its access to the white man's world of medicine and trade. It was a symbiotic relationship, a bridge between two cultures that had once been separated by a chasm of fear and misunderstanding. Clay and Chayton's marriage, born of necessity and violence, deepened into a love that was as vast and enduring as the Montana scumman of Sathai. They were a study in contrasts, the quiet, introspective cowboy and the fierce, passionate falcon. But they complemented each other perfectly, their strengths and weaknesses balancing each other out. He taught her about the world of commerce and politics, of ledgers and contracts. She taught him about the world of the spirit, of the interconnectedness of all living things, of the rhythms of the earth. Their home was a reflection of their union, a place where two worlds met and merged. The sturdy log and stone house was filled with the scent of sage and sweetgrass, the walls adorned with both fine oil paintings and intricate crow beadwork. The library, once filled only with leather-bound volumes of Shakespeare and Milton, now also housed collections of crow folklore and history. They had children, 2 sons and a daughter, who were a beautiful blend of their 2 heritages. They had Clay's stormy grey eyes and Chayton's raven-black hair. They were raised to be proud of both their Forrester and their Apsaalooke ancestry, to walk in both worlds with confidence and grace. They learned to ride and rope and brand cattle, but they also learned to track and hunt and speak the language of the crow. They were the living embodiment of the bridge their parents had built. The story of the rich cowboy and the native beauty he had saved the woman he had been forced to marry became a part of the folklore of the territory. It was a story told around campfires and in saloons, a story that grew and changed with each telling. Some said he had stolen her away from a jealous rival, others that she had bewitched him with her strange, savage beauty. But those who knew them, who had seen the love and respect they shared, knew the truth. They knew that it was not a story of capture or coercion, but a story of salvation of 2 lost souls who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. Clayton Forrester, the man who had once valued his solitude above all else, became a respected elder in both the white and the Crow communities. He was a man of great wealth and influence, but he was also a man of great wisdom and compassion. He never forgot the lesson he had learned on that fateful day in the Badlands, that the greatest riches are not measured in land or cattle, but in the connections we make, in the love we share, in the lives we touch. Chayton the Falcon, who had once been a fugitive, became a revered matriarch, a woman of great strength and wisdom. She was a healer, a teacher, a leader. She never lost her fierce, independent spirit, but she had found a home, a place where she could be both Apsaalooke and Forrester, a place where she was not just accepted, but celebrated. And so the legacy of the Falcon and the Forrester lived on, a testament to the power of love to overcome even the deepest of divides. It was a story that was whispered on the wind that swept across the plains, a story that was etched into the very landscape of the Montana Territory. It was the story of a rich cowboy who had saved a dying native beauty, and in doing so had created a legend. It was the story of a forced marriage that had become a true love story, a story of 2 people who had found their destiny in the heart of the wild, untamed West. It was a story they would tell their grandchildren of how a single act of mercy had changed the world one heart at a time. And as the years passed and the world changed around them, The love of Clayton and Chayton Forrester remained a constant, a beacon of hope in a world that was often dark and unforgiving. Theirs was a love story for the ages, a true Wild West drama that was more real and more powerful than any fiction. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of the Old West. The story of Clay and Chayton is a reminder that love can blossom in the most unexpected of places, and that courage and compassion can bridge any divide. It's a tale of two worlds colliding not in hatred, but in a shared destiny, proving that sometimes the greatest treasures are not found in gold, but in the human heart. If their story of love, sacrifice, and survival moved you, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with your friends and family who appreciate timeless Western drama, and don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you won't miss our next story from the untamed frontier. We'll see you on the next dusty trail.